much. Morning, folks. Welcome to day 2. Welcome to dentistry. Apologies for the late starting of this session. I understand that the session before in the main ballroom overran slightly, so the timetable has been pushed back for the morning by about 5-10 minutes. So apologies for that. We have an expert panel today with, I hope they don't mind me saying, decades of experience between them. Brief introductions. We have with us Gabriela Puello, who is the General Manager of Bupa Dental Care. She was formerly the Chief Strategy Officer for the Bupa Group, and before that spent 11 years in Bupa's Spanish business. For the last 2 of those, she was General Manager. Her current role makes her responsible for defining the vision and strategy for the UK and for the Republic of Ireland Dental Business Unit, and she is driving growth through operational transformation. Gabriela, welcome.
Thank you.
Uriyo Nahainen is...
There we go.
Oh, do you know what? We practiced this before because it's so difficult for us English. Do pick me up.
52-year-old, and I don't think any Anglo-Saxon has ever said it right. So.
I got it right in the rehearsal as well. Has held a series of high-profile healthcare sector jobs, most recently as chair of Pan-European dental platform Curaos. He's on the board of Ambea, and he was at the helm of Finland-based Terveystalo when it successfully IPO'd. Before healthcare, he worked in what he calls a more classical business line, including brewery, I think, from memory.
Absolutely.
Which gives him an interesting perspective, and he tells me he has a particular interest in using data to benefit the individual. Hello and welcome.
Thank you.
Christian Dubé is a partner at August Equity. He focuses almost exclusively on healthcare investments, with an interest in where healthcare meets education and technology. August Equity has been invested in fast-growing dental partners, which is the UK-based dental chain, since 2017. Christian, it's good to chat again. Welcome.
Thank you.
And last but by no means least, we have Ben Faircloth. Ben is a partner at LEK Consulting with more than 18 years consulting experience. Ben serves as the global co-head of the firm's healthcare sector. He's also a member of LEK's European Regional Management Committee. Ben, you're an old hand at this. Welcome back to the stage.
Thank you.
And I think you're going to set the scene for us with a short presentation, if you'd like to use the podium. Thank you.
There we go. I'm just going to talk through literally 3 slides, keeping it very brief to tee up some themes that I think we'll go through in more detail. Great to see many familiar faces in the room today, by the way. So what are we seeing in European dentistry right now? Well, this chart takes a little bit of explaining, but what it is it's Google search data on the terms dentist in 4 key languages in Europe, and it shows weekly searches for those words, all indexed back to the equivalent week in 2019. So if the line is above 100, it means people are looking more for that word in that given week in the period you see below on the x-axis than they were in 2019. In other words, arguably, their level of interest in dentistry has gone up. And what you can see is, although there was obviously a big shock with the first lockdown, the first grey block on the left, generally you've seen a lot of interest in dentistry compared to pre-pandemic levels. And I think that's a really important point. So the key message here is, not only has demand and interest been resilient, it's actually been growing, arguably. The level of interest in dentistry on the patient side, or the patient-consumer side, as I think we increasingly find ourselves saying, has been growing. Why is that? Well, it's because we spend lots of time staring at our faces now, or at least have done for the last 18 months or so. And that has really driven growing awareness. We were seeing this already, as I think many of you know, before the pandemic, but has really accelerated interest in facial aesthetics and the quality of people's smiles. It's also been helped by the fact that we see on the supply side the evolution of a whole range of propositions aimed at benefiting essentially from the changing landscape in the aligner world and the ability of a wider number of participants to enter that space. And so you see demand on the one hand going up significantly for cosmetic dentistry, and you see a supply side that's able to respond by coming to market with a whole range of propositions and offers to take advantage of that. What this means, and this is my last slide, so I thought I'd keep it very brief, is that generally we are hearing across Europe with the clients we're working with that acceptance of dental networks, DSOs, corporate platforms, call them what you will, is continuing to grow gradually. And the reason we say gradually is simply that I think all of us know in this room that acceptance of platforms, particularly in some countries, especially in Northern Europe, has taken time, is taking time to grow. There are very understandable and acceptable reasons why a number of clinicians feel very passionately about independence and owner-manager models, but we all, I think, have seen for a number of years growing interest, particularly from younger clinicians, often who are looking for more flexible ways of working, in the opportunities that DSOs can offer. Having said that, I think what we've seen in more recent months is growing interest in those platforms linked to some of the trends I was just mentioning. So firstly, the ability of those networks to invest behind cosmetic treatments, to invest in the hardware, the software that facilitates that kind of activity is generally greater than it is for single-site clinics and sole practitioners. Also, we see investment behind value-based offerings to aid patient access. That's particularly relevant in countries like the UK, where NHS positions, NHS patient waiting lists are very full, and very often people want to get access. I'm not talking here about cosmetic treatment, I'm talking here often about checkups and hygienist treatments and basic restorative work. And so, again, we see the supply side reacting with value-based offerings to improve access. And we also saw in the lockdowns the opportunity for the DSOs to offer something of a safe haven for clinicians. What do I mean by that? Well, the most straightforward way of describing it was in the first lockdown. We heard from a lot of dentists that were in network saying one of the great things about being part of a bigger group was we got faster access to PPE. We had people centrally helping us understand what the regulatory environment was and helping us navigate that. If we were forced to close, we were given updates as to when it was likely we were going to be able to reopen and under what conditions. So generally, the DSO community has had the opportunity to provide clinicians and patients with more of what they've been looking for through this obviously very difficult period. And that's had a very important knock-on effect. I wouldn't want to say or give the impression that we think clinician recruitment and retention is a problem that everyone has solved and the DSOs find straightforward. It's obviously a big challenge for all networks that we talk to across the country, and indeed, across the continent. And indeed, it's a big challenge, I think, across healthcare, and indeed most industries right now are looking for people. But certainly these aspects of DSOs and their ability to service patient demand and to provide things clinicians are looking for is helping with recruitment and retention. And so gradually we continue to see the process of consolidation in Northern Europe in particular. When you look at the French and German markets, which remain really very unconsolidated, we continue to see that gradual process, in some cases picking up some steam. Again, I don't want to overstate it. There's a lot of people in those countries who don't seek to be part of bigger networks, but we do see these trends coming together to support that gradual consolidation process. And in our view, that's something that is going to carry on. And then, of course, you talk about countries like the UK. Some people may say that the UK is a consolidated market. It really isn't. It's vastly unconsolidated still, and we continue to see interest in this country too around consolidation moving forward. So overall, an interesting time for the patient consumer over this period, as we've all been staring at ourselves non-stop on Teams and on Zoom, and an interesting time for the networks that have been reacting to those trends.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ben. So we can't ignore it. I'm going to have to start with COVID. Apologies. We don't want to labour certainly what's happened too much, but it's unavoidable, so let's get it out of the way first. We know it had a profound effect on healthcare services. We know that in many jurisdictions it had a serious effect on dentistry. So I guess my opening question is, not how did it affect your business particularly, but how is the recovery going? How far are we clawing back? Where are we today? Christian, I'll start with you. You're sort of 75% reliant on NHS payments, I think?
Yeah, between 70 and 75% NHS. So I think, obviously, COVID's sort of immediate impact across the sort of the sector, the private practices were asked to completely shut for a couple of months. The NHS practices were in the main asked to shut for a few months, with the exception of the urgent dental centres, which were effectively doing triaging, or the main practices were doing the triaging into the urgent dental centres. I think the NHS has been very supportive in the main of the sector through COVID. So we've had the UDA contracts fulfilled by the NHS, albeit with a little bit of discount for effective non-costs sort of incurred for some of the equipment and materials costs. But I think in the main, the NHS have been effectively funding the NHS practices in the anticipation, therefore, that the dentists themselves get their pay on a usual basis. I think through the back end of last year, we did see the volumes start to tick up when practices were allowed to open. I think I heard statistics. There are probably more private-focused providers here, but I think the statistics said that the private-only practices were up over 100%, sort of 110% plus on sort of year-on-year basis. So activity levels had gone up. I think the one thing that we are struggling with in the NHS part of the market now is the fact that while the contracts have been effectively continued to be fulfilled by the NHS in terms of payment, I think their requirement for delivery stood at 20% originally. We're now at 60%, and we're expecting that to go up to 85% of the usual contract, in spite of their remaining fallow time between treatments, the minimum fallow time being 10 minutes between treatments, and so you are somewhat constrained versus normal levels of activity and treatment. So it's going to be an interesting sort of few months to come, half a year to come, to see how quickly the NHS practices can come back to a slightly more normalized level of activity.
Sure. Same question, Gabriella. And are you feeling constrained by the rules and regulations that are still in place, or how are you finding it?
It is limiting. I think you've described perfectly well what the situation is that we're facing. I think one of the things that is most challenging, and especially because of the way the system is structured, we have a very big backlog. We've been asked by the NHS to prioritize emergency care, urgent care, et cetera, but a lot of the patients that are coming today, even with the needs that they have, are higher than the needs of patients were prior to the pandemic, is because they haven't had care for such a long time. So, if you band 2, which would be, fillings, for example, you could have an average person have 3 fillings, get paid the same amount. If they're now coming, patients are coming in with 6, 7 fillings, it takes a lot longer to be able to treat that patient for the same amount of money. So there are aspects to productivity that we're finding that are challenging, and it is a balancing act to manage the expected lack of change on the IPC in infection control procedures and that 10-minute fallow period that you mentioned, and the backlog that we're having to manage. It's going to be interesting to see how the NHS dentistry is able to manage that backlog in the coming months, especially as the targets get more pressured. So I don't think we're out of the woods yet. I think there's still a long way to go just to get back to normal, even just with COVID going through. So
I think across the broader healthcare spectrum, there's obviously the pent-up demand, and I think the latest sort of, at least guesswork, is saying that there's about two years' worth of pent-up demand for even just usual checkups.
The obvious question, forgive me, we'll come to you in a second. The obvious question is, can you take advantage of that pent-up demand? Given the restrictions that are in place, are you able to use that to your advantage, to eat into it, which is of everyone's benefit, not least the patients?
I think with the NHS, you've got to be obviously quite careful. I think there's an element of, so we do a mixture of NHS and private work.
Yeah.
There has been a huge boom in private growth over the last year. There was growth, fantastic growth in the private part of the market pre-pandemic, sort of upwards, or a number of players were getting upwards of double-digit percentage growth on private revenue. I think we're still seeing that now. We're seeing the skew towards the aesthetic side of the market, as Ben talked about. So a lot on, we're spending a lot of money investing in the scanners, 3D scanners, so people can see their smiles sort of firsthand. But I think in terms of treating those sort of urgent appointments and the people that have, frankly, there was a number of people who didn't want to come back to surgery, to a practice too quickly. You're starting to see that trickle in a little bit better now, but I don't think you're suddenly going to whack out that waiting list.
Okay. Uri, I think you've got a more pan-European perspective, haven't you, perhaps? What's your take on it, looking from a wider European view?
Yeah, I mean, I think the points around UK, I think they're quite similar across continental Europe. Each market behaved differently at different times.
Sure.
And so you would have had Netherlands being practically shut down on the first wave, whereas Italy completely opened, and Italy got shut down on the second wave. And then everything kind of went into this kind of 90% demand, whereas you needed to keep much more staff simply because of the regulations. So I think it was quite and we're clearly not out of that, but I think the situation is significantly improved this year, or now, and now towards it. And so I think, there is not one European picture, there is not one legislative picture, and so every market needs to behave at its own pace and within its own rules a little bit, and the reimbursement rules have changed quite a lot. And so the governments have taken a completely different view on subsidies, for example. And so Netherlands decides that if you're private equity owned, you're not, they look at the size of the company as the total PE group. Italy doesn't, and so it's extremely complex.
So where are you happiest then? If you're looking at your European network or your familiarity, where would you rather be a dentist?
Oh, dentist. I think from a dentist point of view, I think the situation is relatively similar, and I think the point that Ben said, which I think is actually the key point, is that when it comes to platforms, I think quite a lot of these dentists are finally seeing the value of a platform, because we were able to put together, safety procedures, backup procedures, all of these kind of things that a smaller clinic usually did not do. So this was the first time that they are, I think, positively seeing the value added, the quality value added that a organized group can do, which I think is a real benefit going forward.
Ben, anything that you wanted to add to that?
No, I think the points are well made. I think as I mentioned, I think we see quite different levels of starting point for consolidation at the moment, but the thing that we see is pretty common across the region is high levels of interest, certainly from the investor community, in dental networks, and indeed everything that supplies it. We've touched on a couple of those things too, and there's just a lot of investment that I think is quite keen to find its way into supporting delivery of more dental care across the region.
Sure. Ignoring digital for now, because that's a topic unto itself, and we'll come on to that question in a second. But you touched on changes to the business model due to COVID. Now, it's interesting because I had this conversation with some of you before. Dentistry was always mindful of hygiene. You've got aerosol generating procedures. So the bar was already set quite high for dentistry, and yet you've been taking further precautions because you've had to.
And there's practically no cases coming out of dentistry.
Well, indeed, such transmissions as there are, they're not coming patient to dentist. They may come from the staff room if the staff are being
not from
less cautious, but not from the dentists. So how have you changed your business models, if at all, due to COVID, other than the essential sort of fallow time? I mean, you already had ventilators, did you, or that you've spent on these, or have you changed anything that you do apart from the timings? Christian?
I think, coming on to the digital piece later, I think there is an element of systems which has been very, very important through COVID. There were a lot of reception staff who were basically told to go home through COVID, being on furlough, etc. And I think that's partly because you don't want patients building up in the waiting areas, etc. But also, there's been the move to self-booking for patients. There's been a move for proper people planning in the practice. Yep. So dentists, nurses, receptionists, or sort of wider sort of support staff. I think we have, in fact, August have a separate business called Agilio, which does compliance software and HR software and online CPD for the dental sector, as well as GP, hospitals, etc. And I think we've seen a huge uptake from the individual practices who are wanting to sort of get the infrastructure there. They're years behind. I always think of healthcare as sort of a bit of a laggard in adoption of technology, and I do think that the individual mum and pups have struggled to sort of have the time and energy to spend on this. And I think this has been, we've seen it across the sector, it's been a bit of a wake-up call to actually just get this sort of infrastructure in place. You do need, everyone is struggling with staffing. How do you make sure that you've got efficient workforce planning? you do need to make sure you've got full sort of history of your staff and your dentists.
And that you have enough staff, but we'll make on to that in a second, because that's obviously another
Yeah, but
consideration.
I would add to that point. I think I can see it across healthcare, elderly care, dentistry, exactly the same thing, which is platforms have been trying to find their, let's say, their place, and really there's been this kind of conflict between a smaller clinic and a chain. Now suddenly, you know, the digital investments, the process investments, the quality requirements. Actually, this COVID time has actually somehow brought forward the need to have strong process control and quality control. And suddenly, I think, we chains come out a little bit better. There's more even playing field. And I think that's something that I find it very positive, that we with a completely different dialogue around what is process, what is quality in be it elderly care, dentistry, healthcare. And process has a big part in it. And
I would fully agree with that, and I think on top of the DSOs and the dentist realizing this and the importance of this, because I think that until now we've had to a certain degree take people kicking and screaming into these kinds of common operating platforms, common quality measures, compliance, et cetera, et cetera. But the pandemic has really brought to the fore that these things are valuable, that they're useful, and they've also changed the mindset of, you know, of course we have to see the patient in the dental chair. There is no other way to see a patient, and all of a sudden when you can't, you find that, you know, maybe you can't do everything, obviously you can't, but there are a lot more things you can do remotely than a lot of people thought before, and I think that it's that change of mentality that I think has really made a difference across the workforce. Now we just have to keep that momentum going, because it's just so easy to go back to how we did things before in terms of the mindset. But the platform and the value of the platform, fully agree with you that has made that's really brought it to the fore. And now where we want to go in terms of you know, the digital bit, which we will get to later.
Yeah. Forgive me for sectioning them.
No, that makes total sense. But that makes sense, but that is a base. If you don't have that, it's really hard to move to the next level.
That's exactly the point. It's impossible to digitalize unless you've centralized and you have blue books and best practices and procedures. Now I think the entire industry is more ready for digitalization than 2 years ago.
Fully agree.
And you mentioned it's an easier sell. It's an easier sell to your existing dentists who you're trying to bring with you. But presumably, similarly, it's an easier sell to those who aren't part of your group that you're trying to have join you. So how has this affected M&A? Has it made M&A easier? We talked about people perhaps knocking on the door. They want the umbrella protection of a parent company to help them out when they're looking at getting PPE, etc. How's the M&A market? Are things easier? Are they different?
We're not doing M&A at the time.
That's the wrong question. I shouldn't have addressed that to you, because I am aware that your M&A department is not as populous as once it was, deliberately. Nope. Right, forgive me. Christian?
From our perspective, I think M&A definitely slowed down through COVID. I think we have been very focused on buying the right sort of practices in terms of the size, in terms of the UDA contract and the potential margins you can make there, what the dentist availability is like. So our chief exec there loves to talk about sheep and no seagulls. So nothing too rural, nothing too coastal, so that you haven't got a very short supply of dentists.
Yeah.
I think that's a sort of key in the M&A market. If you speak to Christie's, who do a lot of the broking in the sector, there remains a decent chunk of principal purchasing of practices. I think it's around 70 or 80% of the M&A at the moment remains from principal buyers, which surprised me actually, because you would have thought there's a lot of corporates out there, not necessarily in size of the overall sector, but there are quite a number buying. But from our perspective, you can already limit your 10,500 England and Wales practices probably to about 1,300, 1,500 of sort of the key focus for us in terms of 5 chairs and easy to recruit areas. I think when we're looking at the last year's worth of profitability of practices, you also have to be pretty smart as to, I have to say dentists are pretty savvy about managing the contract and managing their activity levels. And I think you've got to be pretty smart about making sure that you know what is a genuine sort of underlying profitability there. I know the private practices have been trading hands quite a lot more than the NHS practices over the last year. Portman have been growing very, very strongly. And I do think that's an element of the sort of the private practitioners who are taking this opportunity to exit the market, or some of them are. I think in the NHS world, it's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of the owners and the dentists themselves. I think I saw a statistic that 951 dentists left, 951 fewer dentists doing NHS dentistry last year. Again, surprised me a little bit because there's a number of dentists who are wanting to obviously get paid if the practice was shut, and so wanting to go back into somewhere they've got this sort of guaranteed contract. We've seen sort of sort of record level, low levels of dentist vacancy. But I do think for the owners of NHS practices, they're sort of getting their NHS contract paid on that sort of constrained supply dynamic. I do think that will change as it gets harder and harder, and you are going to see a flurry of NHS owners, practice owners, who are going to want to sell.
And in a word, am I right in assessing that as you saying you're being slightly more picky about, yes?
Absolutely, yeah. Some practices are definitely best run by principal owners. If it's a 2-3 chair practice, frankly, for a corporate, if you lose a dentist, that's half or a third of your revenue.
Sure.
That's straight below you're below the bottom line by that point.
Yeah. Ben, sorry, did you want to come in?
No, I was just add one thing, coming back to these kind of strengthening of the platforms. Basically, one of the problems that dentistry, I think, has seen versus, for example, healthcare, is that when you do M&A, you haven't really had a platform to integrate to.
Right.
Now, we're seeing increasingly that the chains have a concept, systems base, where it becomes much easier to acquire and integrate to an existing platform, which I think will, in turn, at some point in time, I think it will increase the activity.
Yeah.
Right now, maybe everyone's a little bit picky because it's been quite difficult, and it's quite difficult to foresee what the market looks like in 6 months, but I'm pretty sure it's going to come back quite quickly. And that will then in turn lead potentially that smaller clinics and the multiples of a smaller clinics are going to go up, so you're going to have to be able to integrate as we go forward.
Well, that's what we saw in the Spanish market a lot, was that a lot of the clinics were being bought up, and what was actually happening was that the small 1 to 2 chair clinics were closing. And they were going and moving over. If they couldn't sell, they ended up working in the corporates, because the model there was a little different. Was a lot of greenfield, but that's what ended up happening.
And if you were a small clinic, you would want to be bought by a platform. And if there wasn't a platform, you wouldn't be interested. Is that a fair assessment? Or?
I don't think smaller. I haven't seen much small clinic activity buying another small clinic. I've seen only platforms acquiring, footprint basically, or customer base.
Sure. Yeah. Ben, forgive me, I was coming to you.
No, that's right.
Thoughts and comments?
Well, I think if you go back 5 years or so, we've always been asked at LEK the question, what's the benefit to an owner of a platform, of having a platform make it bigger? And in particular, increasingly we get asked, what's the benefit of being international?
Yeah.
And we've tended to say that one of the biggest benefits is having a systematic approach to clinician engagement, ranging from how you think about clinical governance and representation at the board, all the way through to clinical benchmarking, providing access to data, consistent information, but also some of these other benefits we talked about in terms of system management, process management, that kind of thing. And also just giving a bit more structure, saying to people you can work flexibly when you want. Procurement as well, but that's certainly true on the cost side, but people tend to often ask us about the revenue side. And so clinician engagement, how you grow the clinician pool, is a key part of it. But I do think what's been coming through strongly in more recent years, and we have touched on a bit, is the patient engagement side as well. So helping that investment in digital connectivity to the patient, allowing online booking, giving them greater flexibility, greater choice, then talking about some of the other things I know we will come on to. But it's been interesting to watch those two topics continuing to gain pace, I think, particularly around internationalization, with the patient side arguably closing that gap on the clinician engagement side. Although, as I said before, most people we talk to still say recruitment and retention of people is right up there in terms of things that need managing day to day.
Sure. And finally, to wrap this up, I think Uri, you have views on multiples. Are multiples rising? What's the market like for M&A and pricing?
No, I would say rather that at some point in time before COVID, I think the multiples were very high. And then what often happens, and this is not dentistry alone, I think it's across all of these care segments, you see that the multiples between a large platform and a small player start to close to one another, and then they'll fall back. And I would say there's much, maybe it's more realistic levels of multiples, but I would guess that we'll see multiples rising again soon. As the activity again comes back, because the European platforms, there's going to be more European platforms, or let's say there's going to be a clear move now towards the real platforms across Europe.
Sure.
And so that will mean that there's going to be activity.
Okay. We've had a question via the app. We've got screens here, so if you want to access the app, then I can read the questions. What is the panel's view on value creation with regard to insourcing the lab activity, brackets, in Germany? Would anybody like to field that question?
I can kick off. I think if you start from the perspective that two things are important. One is that we are seeing increasing digitalization of the workflow. And that's true on the lab side as well as at the chair side, in the practice side. And therefore, connectivity is growing anyway. That is an inherently helpful thing in the context of why you might think to offer your own lab services. But the second crucial thing is, and this varies by country to some degree, but generally, you have to be quite careful how you manage the clinicians around this topic because they are very sensitive to it. Certainly in the UK, they are hypersensitive. Some continental markets a bit less so, but generally, this is a super important part of the process for them, and if it goes wrong, they're the one who gets the problem with the patient, and they feel that very personally, quite understandably. So for them, the things that are typically really crucial are the quality and the speed. And so you have to, I think, if you're going to have an insourcing strategy, which generally is something I think it makes sense for most bigger organizations to think about, at least in part, for some of your needs, you need to be very focused on those two things, being able to deliver the speed and the quality. And actually, arguably, to do that in the context of giving the clinicians a choice so that they could still opt to use an in-house service or an external service. But obviously, if you're going to have in-house, you want to nudge people towards them taking that by virtue of giving them better quality and speed. So I think it's a sensible thing to think about, but it needs careful management. But the digitization of workflow helps.
Okay.
And I agree with that. We have labs, and that is a very tricky balance. Of gaining that benefit from the workflow. You do have to make it a win-win. You can't force dentists down that direction. And even US DSOs, where quite a lot of them have reverse integrated into labs, they don't mandate it because of that issue. The other thing to look at is that regulation varies by country. So there are countries where you technically can't own the dental clinics and the labs. So, and then the dentist preference also varies. So models like in Spain, you can be much more, well, these are the labs we use. You can choose between these, but these are the ones we use, whereas in the UK, it is very much more an individual choice. So there is an awful lot of variety, but it is an opportunity. Don't know about Germany so far.
Well, yeah, and I would only add one thing, which is very often with these things, with dental labs, I think and clinicians, I think the dialogue between how does the clinician present the choices to a patient is the key here, because now that there's more and more technology, I think it's quite a big learning curve to say, well, dear Mrs. Customer, you have three choices. You can have a Chinese implant, you can have one that we do milling here, or you can have the one that we do in our own lab, and there are different pros and cons, and so that dialogue will change. And I think that is going to put a little bit of pressure to our clinicians on how do they present these choices. Come digitalization again in play. Other than that, I would fully agree.
Interesting. Let's deal with the question about embracing digital technology. What has COVID taught you and indeed the patients about embracing digital technology? What's new and exciting? What are the developments? Gabriela, do you want to open the pitch?
Well, I think going back, it's not that there's that much new and exciting. A lot of the technologies that are really growing today have been around for a while. It's been more of a question of getting people to uptake it. Intraoral scanners, which is the big area that is being pushed forward now and leading to that digital workflow. They weren't taught at dental schools. No. And there is a big learning curve for dentists and a big investment on their part to get onto that bandwagon. And so I think that COVID, going back to what we were talking about before, has driven a little bit more of moving in that direction, both because the consumer is demanding it more, but also because dentists have seen that this is a direction of the future. It's also true that the technology is getting better, and as there is a greater interest in aesthetic, being able to show people what it's going to look like helps to drive that uptake, because you can see the real benefits of investing in that. But I think the next frontiers are really going to be moving into artificial intelligence and how we can start to use those kind of techniques, which have been around for a while, but they're starting to get to the point where they're good enough to assist in the diagnosis. And at least for those of us in countries like the UK, where there's a huge scarcity of talent, everything that we can do to maximize dentist time focused on where they add value, I think will help to enhance and improve the service that we can provide customers. So I think that there is really a move in that direction, both on the one hand because consumers are pushing it, because dentists have realized that that actually this is useful, but also as the industry consolidates and as people invest in it, it's going to drive it as well, mainly hugely driven because of a scarcity of skilled labor in this market. In certain markets, it doesn't occur in all of them, but in those where there's scarcity, this is the one way that you can expand a workforce that you have no other real way to expand quickly.
Sure, thank you for that. Uri, I think my initial question ties into what you said earlier about the need for centralization, that if you haven't got that right, you can't do anything digitally. You need to have that strong base.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about digitalization, be it in any of the care segments, I think we very often talk about the consumer-facing one, so the patient-facing one. But I would say that for me at least, I would say that there are two additional very exciting elements. One is the internal process change that digital workflows can actually allow, and the efficiency that creates, and the transparency that creates, and the quality that creates, i.e. that reduces the quality variances between individuals dramatically. And then I think we'll come on to quite an exciting piece, which I would call, let's call it medical quality, but it's really how do we manage these care flows in such a ways that we are more and more outcome based, and we are better as an industry to talk about the value we create as opposed to simply a black box and then a app. So I really like these three things, but I think when you then talk about internal workflows, I would say that it's quite difficult to go from decentralized pen and paper to digitalized workforce flows, because you simply don't have any data. And so you need to modularize it, and you need to centralize it. You need to start to steer some of your workflows in a very coherent manner. Then you can automate it, and then that leads to digitalization. But I think it's a journey. And if you're still thinking about it, then you're going to be busy, because it's going to take a few years.
It's going to be a longer journey.
Yeah. So I mean, I've worked on workflow digitalization for 12 years in healthcare. And it's still lots to do. So I think that's just the way of life now. But I really think that will create the ultimate value, which is that once we get the workflows up and running, we get the quality measurements up and running, we start to produce vast amounts of data that we can convert into quality improvements, into artificial intelligence, into prevention, into combining dentistry with general health care, all of these things. And I think that piece is extremely exciting. But we're not fully there yet, but I think it's closer than for many, many years ago. So, and COVID has speeded that transformation up, I think.
Agree.
Christian, I can see you've had a specific question there from Tom Real at IDH. Does anybody want to come in on that last point before I fire this question at you?
Well,
I'm keen to take an audience question.
Well, the only point I'd make is we'll be able to answer your question more specifically at the end of the week when the IDS show has played out in Cologne. Turns out that healthcare conferences are like London buses. You wait 18 months and then 2 show up at once. So we'll see. But I imagine it's going to be quite a lot around the post-Invisalign world and all the innovation around that. I think increasing use of elements of AI, it's a phrase that can get bandied around, but elements of AI to help with diagnosis and help that patient-consumer interface as well. And of course, just wider digitization and all the elements of the workflow that go with that. So I imagine we'll see a lot more of that. And I imagine a lot of the people in this room will probably be in Cologne later this week to see some of that too.
Fantastic.
The only thing I would add, I think there is a surprising amount of data available in the dental world compared to a lot of other, particularly care sector, for example. And obviously, it's being monitored by the NHS and the sort of the people monitoring the contracts for quality purposes and just making sure there's no sort of gaming of the contracts. But I think the likes of Henry Schein with their sort of practice software, it's actually a relatively sophisticated system, but getting the dashboards out and getting sort of meaningful data is the sort of the secret sauce that no one's done properly properly as yet. And I think there's, we're investing in things like Power BI in the business to make sure that, every incremental change you can make on sort of white space, limiting white space and sort of filling up diaries in advance has a huge, huge value, particularly when I think, do not attends have sort of gone up through COVID when people have sort of said, oh, I don't want to turn up to the practice. So I think it's a lot more around the workforce efficiency rather than sort of wholesale change. I think much of the dentist to patient digital sort of tools have sort of been implemented already, or have had to over the last year. But I think we are talking about the incremental changes around workforce in particular, just making sure you've got, the key ingredient to keeping a dentist happy is make sure they've got a nurse. Nursing is one of the hardest things in the sector right now, across the sector, across healthcare, even in the NHS. I think pay will be going up, and it is going up. So I think that's the key, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, the whole HR piece is then something, it's the topic on its own.
Yeah.
But I think HR, if you combine digital workforce, digital tools, and these platforms, I think we can do quite exciting things when it comes to the whole workforce management, and I think that's something we're not very good at yet, especially if you look at across European countries. So that's probably one of the areas that I think quite many will be investing into.
Okay, we're in the last 10 minutes, so let's take this question and see if there are any other questions. So have a think, folks. To Christian, will NHS activity in the UK ever recover to pre-COVID levels? And that's from Tom Real, who's of course the CEO of IDH.
Crystal ball. I think there is, obviously we've got the guidance coming on the sort of latter half of this year and what sort of the UDA requirements will be. I think NHS fulfillment has been going down a slippery slope for many years, as we've known, whichever year it was, 2012, 13, I've forgotten what it was, the contract change. But I think there's obviously a move. We have a lot of practices in Yorkshire and Humber, and they've been one of the sort of early movers in the sector around flexible commissioning. And I think that's a big change for the sector, and it's likely to be adopted pretty widely. So for those that aren't aware, I think it basically means that you can do an element of your contract through other means, sort of going to schools, teaching kids how to brush their teeth, going to care homes, etc. It doesn't always have to be done by a dentist. I think the requirement from the NHS on the UDA contracts is obviously 96% of the contracted volume, and anything below that you have to start paying back the NHS. I think the average independent, I think, was doing 92% of their UDA fulfillment. We've seen a number of the corporates slip below the 90%, sometimes purposefully, because the contract is just not profitable, and they're actually effectively swapping the NHS work for more private work. So be it sort of the incremental margin benefit on sort of private dentistry. But I think we are going to see some change in the contract. We don't know what it's going to look like, but I do think the amount of NHS work is likely to change long term. I think there's a number of people who have started paying for their you've been paying for white fillings or whatever it might be instead of the silver amalgam from the NHS, and I think we're going to see that trend continue. We've seen, I think, roll back the clocks. I think it was about 60-40 NHS private in terms of the revenue spent. You'll know this better than I do. I think now private is 3.9 billion compared to 3.6 in NHS. And so I think we've got we're already on that journey. That's obviously a bit of, the volume of different treatments are available on private, as well as sort of the patient awareness of what is out there, and pricing, obviously. But I do think people are getting more and more comfortable paying for their own treatments, particularly when the NHS, while the NHS are effectively paying for dentistry from the patients still have to contribute. Sometimes that contribution can be more than what the practices make back from the NHS, which is rather amusing.
Okay, and a final question, I suspect.
Can I just come in briefly, because I have a stronger view, Christian. Over the last 12 months, I think we've seen a very strong migration from NHS activity to private. Clinicians have got an appetite now for doing more private dentistry in the UK, and I personally think it is unlikely we will ever see NHS activity recover to pre-COVID levels. I think it is a shift. We don't even understand yet the size of that shift, but the jury is out, and we will see further down.
I think in the US, if you look to the US where they were 10 years ago, 15 years ago, in terms of how much an average patient would pay on dentistry, we're miles behind that. So I think that's still growing. As I said, double-digit growth in private revenue is definitely still there, and we're seeing it even in majority NHS practices.
Okay, fantastic. This is now a quick fire round, folks. You can all see the clock in front of me. So, final question. In the US, there are several large specialist chains focused on implants. Why don't we see European chains focused on implants? The answer there is usually money. Where there's money, these things happen. But who'd like to address that?
I would say there are, number one, it still depends a lot by country. So that there's quite different procedures around European countries. There is nothing that says that we would not see. It's just that we haven't seen them yet. And I think it comes back into the point that I think Ben alluded to, which is there's still a little bit of a question mark out on what's the value add for pan-European chains, really. Because the markets are still quite different. There are clear points where you can deliver value, but it's not, US is still more homogeneous market than Europe is.
Yeah. Size of the market, 300
the size of the market,
versus...
yeah. Plus the spend. It's a private market.
Yeah.
But yes, exactly. And if you just said 10 years behind, I think that's the key difference. People are used to paying for healthcare. They're used to being a consumer of healthcare. And if somebody says, I offer this, I'm good at this, Americans are quite used to taking the initiative to then go and deal with that. We're used to more of in most countries in Europe, a gatekeeping model of dentistry that starts with kind of primary care, but the same person then gives you incremental care beyond that.
True. Final question then from me. It's probably a 1 or 2 word answer. What keeps you awake at night? So the biggest challenge that you face, we haven't really gone into staffing, so I might get a stock answer of staffing from all of you, which would be dull but accurate. Just going across.
You answered it.
Well,
answered. I was going to say, yeah, that's mine.
But I've got a minute to play out, so I'm going to go across anyway. Christian.
I think, as I mentioned, it's nursing actually more than dentists that we are seeing the sort of the critical pinch point, really. And I think that's across the healthcare sector, not just dentistry.
Gabriella?
Yeah, it's workforce, most definitely, is our biggest worry bead.
And is that 3 across the board? Are you all in agreement about that?
Yeah, the HR definitely, and I would say, if I look at different care sectors, I think we're all in this situation where we need to create much more workplaces that people want to come to, stay at, and then I think we need to create flexibility between different silos more and more. And so data will, for me, is one of those things. How do we manage this in much more transparent way as we go forward?
Unfortunately, that means that we've run out of time. Please do use the app. You can ask questions on the app. You can contact the panelists directly. So If we haven't had time to address what you wanted to hear, please do look at the back of your name badges. You can find out how to access the app. You can ask questions of anybody. You can network with them. Panel are here. Come up and say hello. Thank you all very much for your time, and thank you to the panel. Thank you.